All right, let's dive right into this explainer and, honestly, fundamentally reshape how we perceive our own identity and really reality itself. If you've ever felt this weird tension between the cold scientific description of the universe and your own rich conscious experience of it, well, you're definitely not alone. Today, we're exploring a seriously groundbreaking framework derived from the work of Dr. Nudafa Washarakuldilok called the Open Interdependence Flow, or OIF for short. And this framework does something pretty incredible. It essentially builds a bridge between cutting-edge modern science, stuff like quantum physics and computational neuroscience, and ancient Buddhist philosophy. So let's map out exactly how this works. Are you a permanent object or a temporary process? Now, I know that sounds like a late-night philosophical riddle, but it's actually a deeply scientific question. I mean, we go through life feeling like we're these solid, continuous things moving through a completely independent world. But what if that baseline assumption is just entirely backward? What if you aren't a noun, but a verb? Hooking into this idea requires us to completely challenge our most basic understanding of what we are actually made of.
Section 1. The illusion of separation.
To really get where we're going, we kind of need to look at where we've been. For centuries, our worldview has been totally dominated by substance ontology. This is the whole legacy of Newton and Descartes, right? That mechanistic view that the universe is basically a giant clock made of separate, fixed parts, and that you are just an isolated entity stuck inside it. But an entirely different consensus has emerged, known as process ontology. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, from thermodynamics to cognitive science, and literally tracing back thousands of years to Buddhist thought, we've come to realize that reality isn't made of things at all. It's a continuous, relational flow. Things don't exist independently and then interact. They actually emerge through their interaction.
Section 2. Open Interdependence Flow.
So how do we actually synthesize all these massive ideas? Well, the Open Interdependence Flow framework actively weaves these concepts into a cohesive, testable, and livable worldview. And it's fascinating how three completely different domains point to the exact same truth. First up, from Buddhist philosophy, we have dependent origination, the core rule that nothing exists in isolation. Everything arises through conditions. Second, from modern neuroscience, we have the free energy principle by Carl Friston. This shows that living systems only survive by constantly predicting and adapting to their environment to reduce uncertainty. And third, quantum Darwinism, which tells us that the classical solid world we see actually emerges from quantum possibilities being selected by the environment. The OIF framework acts as this beautiful mirror, reflecting these pillars, showing us that at absolutely every scale of reality, relationship is the fundamental building block.
Section 3. The Relational Vortex.
Okay, so if absolutely everything is this interconnected flow of relationships, where exactly does that leave you? How do we define you within this massive system? Well, in the scientific language of OIF, the self is definitely not a physical substance sitting right behind your eyes. It is a predictive attractor bounded by a Markov blanket. Now, I know that sounds super heavy and academic, but think of it simply as a dynamic statistical boundary. It's a localized, persistent loop that constantly gathers information, makes predictions, and acts on the environment just to maintain its own shape and reduce chaos. So the self is an organizational process. It's an activity, not an object. To really visualize this, think of a whirlpool in a river. When you look at a whirlpool, you can point to it, you can name it, you can even measure its force. It has a very recognizable identity. But if you try to actually isolate it, you realize it possesses absolutely no permanent water molecules of its own. None. It is completely made of the river flowing through it. And according to the OIF framework, this is exactly what your self is. You are a localized, dynamic pattern, a relational vortex, emerging temporarily within the open flow of the cosmos.
Section 4. The Interdependence Interface.
Now, if we're basically just whirlpools in the river, how do we actually experience the edge of our own vortex? Like, what is the actual boundary between us and the outside world? Think of it as a formula. I equals self intersecting with cosmos. We usually think of our skin or maybe our mind as a solid wall keeping the universe out. But OIF redefines this boundary as the interdependence interface. It's a phenomenological overlap. It is a highly permeable, dynamic zone where the localized organization of the self meets the vast, ongoing process of the universe. So you aren't separated by a wall at all. You're connected by an interface.
So what happens when we train our minds to look closely at this interface through practices like, say, Vipassana meditation? Well, that rigid statistical model of the self actually begins to relax. The boundary between inside and outside doesn't get destroyed, rather it just becomes transparent. The separation between the observer and the observed begins to fade away. You basically stop fiercely defending a rigid self-model and start experiencing a deep, fluid participation in reality.
Section 5. Living the open flow.
So how does shifting from a substance ontology to a process ontology actually change how we live day to day? Let's map out the path to awakening here. We usually start at step 1, with a rigid self-model. We think we're completely separate, which creates high friction and suffering, what Buddhism calls dukkha, because we're basically fighting the natural flow of the universe just to maintain our illusion. Step 2 is the crisis point. Our rigid predictions fail, and that boundary begins to dissolve. And yeah, this can be challenging, but step 3 is the breakthrough, transparent participation. We're no longer stressed out trying to defend our ego. Instead, we become a highly adaptive node, smoothly flowing and exchanging energy and information with the rest of reality.
Honestly, it all comes down to this profound realization. The wave does not know it is the ocean, but every wave is the ocean finding itself. Enlightenment, or awakening as framed by the Open Interdependence Flow, isn't about gaining some crazy superpower or escaping reality into some empty void. It is simply the profound realization that we have always been the ocean. It's a shift in perspective where the relational vortex finally recognizes its true nature as the flow itself.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this thought. If you are not a fixed object, but an ongoing process, a vibrant relational interface completely dependent on everything around you, how will you participate in the flow today? When you realize your own well-being is structurally inseparable from the well-being of the entire network around you, how does that change your ethics, your relationships, and your actions? Think about that as you go through the rest of your day.